Welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles, 24/8. I'm Erica.
And I'm Allison. And before we start, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or stream us on Spotify and YouTube. If you're enjoying BC the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. And you can also email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. And today we're bringing you part 2 of our interview with Andrew Cook, author of the new book, Capitol Gains, Exposing the Conflict Between the Beatles and the Record Label That Made Them. In part 1, we dug into the many myths surrounding the Beatles signing to Capitol Records, and Andrew walked us through the new information he uncovered about how that historic deal actually came together. We also talked about Dave Dexter, the Capitol A&R man with the dubious distinction of rejecting the Beatles 4 separate times before the label finally said yes. And we explored the massive marketing campaign Capitol launched to turn Beatlemania into an American phenomenon ahead of those first appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show. So if you haven't heard part 1 yet, you may want to go back and start there for the full story. Today, we pick up where that conversation left off, with the Beatles' relationship with Capitol in the post-Dave Dexter years, the infamous Butcher cover, of course, and how things evolved in the later years of the band as they renegotiated their contract. We also look at how Capitol's relationship with the Beatles changed in the wake of Brian Epstein's death, when the notoriously controversial Allan Klein stepped in as manager. Capitol Gains is out now wherever you get your books. And here's part 2 of our interview with historian Andrew Cook. By the end of 1965, there is a change in management over at Capitol. And Dave Dexter is removed from the Beatles account. He's as close to being fired as he could possibly come and still draw a paycheck. And he's replaced by another producer. So what actually happened that made that change happen?
Bill Miller was the guy who replaced Dexter. You could say it's a little bit like politics. You know, somebody gets fired from the cabinet and they just put someone in their place who's just as awful as they are. The Capitol executives sort of chopped and changed. But I mean, the mainstays were still there, Alan Livingston. I mean, Livingston carries on for a long, long time. Basically, the big thing that had changed was that there'd been a slow build-up. The power balance, if you like, changed because obviously the more successful the Beatles became, they were really holding a lot more of the cards. And even EMI in London, it started off where they were pretty much frog marching the Beatles around, telling them when to record, what to record, not necessarily what to record, but I mean, they had the whip hand creatively. And the Beatles were just, in the early days, just jolly glad that EMI had pulled them off the street and made them start. But as I say, the balance of power soon changes, not just in terms of the amount of money that the Beatles are earning for themselves in EMI, but also in terms of the way that the management goes. Tony Barrow, who I quote at length in my book, he says very, very bluntly that 63, 64, perhaps the first half of 65, Brian Epstein was the manager of the Beatles. He didn't write the music, he didn't perform the music, but, you know, it was Mr. Epstein, no Mr. Epstein. If he said they were going to do this, that's what they were going to do. You reach a point, a pivotal point, probably late 65, where Epstein is basically kowtowing to the Beatles because, as I say, the balance of power has changed and everybody acknowledges that. And of course, the big factor that's behind the question you ask is the fact that EMI gave the Beatles a very limited shelf life contract in 1962 that was due to expire in 1966. In fact, as we said earlier, a lot of people at EMI didn't actually think that they thought the Beatles, they could pull out of the contract with the Beatles probably after a few months because they've only contracted to do 6 tracks. And once they'd recorded 6 tracks, EMI didn't lift a finger to promote Love Me Do. Epstein had to get that promoted himself out of his own pocket. So the people who reluctantly signed up the Beatles at EMI in 62 thought, well, okay, if we've got to sign them, we've got to sign them, but we're only committed to record 6 songs. And if none of those songs are a hit, then we can just turn around and say, sorry, boys, that's what it says in the contract. Nice knowing you. And that would have been the end, I think, of the Beatles. But one thing EMI knew and one thing that Capitol knew is that their contract to this massive gravy train was going to come to a contractual end at the end of 1966. And obviously when you get in 65, the first kind of critical comments that are coming to Capitol Tower via Epstein is never the Beatles directly speaking to Capitol. So let's look at a couple of examples. The sleeves. So they start saying, well, the boys want us to harmonize the sleeves. Can't we do that, please? So Alan Livingston says to Dexter, come on, Dave, why can't we harmonize the sleeves? Dexter goes off the deep end about how awful British sleeves are and says quite accurately, he said, if you look at other places, look at Africa, look at Asia, look at Australia, yes, they occasionally use British album designs, but the design for Beatles 65, that was used in Germany, continental Europe, the Far East. Dexter says, our album sleeves are actually much better designed than London's. We've got really, really creative people here at Capitol Tower. Our product is just so much better. Why should we ditch better product? So it's a matter of opinion, isn't it? But, why should we ditch good artistic product just because London keep picking the phone up? To start with, Livingston, says, oh, okay, Dave, you're the guy. But obviously the main priority of the board at Capitol is to make money. And the absolute nightmare scenario that, Livingston literally keeps waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat is this recurring dream that at the end of 66, the Beatles are going to stick the middle finger up at Capitol and go and sign for an RCA or somebody. So they're now very much locked on to this nightmare scenario where Epstein and the Beatles could say, well, thank you, Capitol. You've done a really great job for us. We're now superstars around the world. But by the way, RCA Victor are offering us $20 million or something,
And I think Brian was making some pretty loud noises in that direction.
He was, yeah, because as we said before, Epstein is Mr. Leverage. That is his stock in trade. He might not be a great businessman in terms of perception, but he knows how to strike a deal. He knows how to maneuver people and put them on the spot. So yeah, he keeps dropping hints about, of course, old chap, later in the year, this contract comes up for renegotiation. I really love to stay with Capitol, but the boys are saying, these album sleeves and this, that, and the other. So Livingston has a very quick overnight conversion to this, and he sends a memo to Dexter. And Dexter, to start with, he just says, sorry, Alan, I know my job, and this is a load of old nonsense. Livingston works on him a bit and eventually strikes up a compromise where he's saying, well, do what you like with the tracks, Dave, but at least let's pay lip service. Let's pretend that we're towing the line a little bit and we're listening to Epstein. Take a couple of their sleeves and put them on your album. What you do with the actual, music, it's up to you. But let's at least play lip service to these guys in London and whatever. And that's, of course, where you get the Rubber Soul sleeve, Rubber Soul album tracks different and the color is different. But I think Livingston becomes more and more afraid that Dexter is going to blow it for Capitol in the sense that, he's reluctantly compromised a tiny little bit on the sleeves, but he's still not going to be told what to do. And the nearer you get to the spring summer of 66, the Capitol board pretty much decide that we cannot gamble the farm on Dave Dexter. He could actually blow the whole thing sky high and Capitol are going to be without the Beatles. And we just can't even think of that. So basically Dexter's called in and, as you said, almost fired, not quite fired. He's given this job of being responsible for the Capitol's re-release program, which, by the way, is just him in a dark room somewhere in the bowels of Capitol Tower. It's a bit like, the Soviet Union when he's sent off to Siberia. He's not dead, but no one sees or hears from him for a very long time. But then again, just to be totally and utterly cynical, do they get some long-haired hippie character to come in and take over the role from Dexter? No, they give it to a guy who's who's literally a clone of Dave Dexter. His name's Bill Miller. Bill Miller, he's on record interviews in Billboard and all the rest of it, actually saying, no, Dexter was right to turn down the Beatles. That's even 1966. And saying that, Dave Clark 5, I can understand why Dexter turned them down and all the rest of it. The only difference between Dexter and Miller is that Bill Miller has actually learned the lesson about in inverted commas, the death of Dave Dexter. So what he does, he doesn't change Dexter's strategy one iota, but what he does do is learn the lesson of Dexter's demise, which is keep on the same wavelength as Epstein and the Beatles, keep the communication channels open, pretend to be consulting them, pretend to be listening to them, pretend to be agreeing with them. And this is where, we get to this very, very interesting subject about, people call it the butcher cover, yesterday and today. I mean, we know actually, we've got a very unique insight into what was going on because there are now some George Harrison letters that he wrote to a DJ, a friend of his in Georgia. And he's talking, this is well before the album comes out. He's talking about, this album, it's coming out. It's made up of tracks from, Rubber Soul, Revolver, whatever. And, you can tell that, obviously the Beatles knew all about it well before it came out because they've been consulted about it. And George knows all about it because he's talking to all his mates about it. And you can tell as well that, he might not be in love with it, but he doesn't hate it either. It's another cash cow that's coming home. The big, again, was it a mistake? Whatever. Bill Miller says to Brian Epstein one day, this album we've been talking about yesterday, by the way, have you got any ideas about the sleeve? He's just put his head on the block, isn't he? Because Epstein then, of course, has to go back because there's been this change of tide, has to go back to the Beatles and say, by the way, boys, Capitol Tower, as you know, they've got this album coming out yesterday and today. They're asking us for ideas for the sleeve. I mean, obviously, they were probably hoping that the Beatles would say, no, we haven't got any ideas, or, here's some innocuous looking photo or something. But no, it wasn't some innocuous looking photo. It was this avant-garde photo session that only a couple of weeks ago they'd been and shot in Chelsea. And John Lennon says, I love this picture. I love this picture.
Of course he does.
Here's an idea for the cover. Epstein, the blood drains from his face when he sees it. And he says to Tony Barrow, obviously once the Beatles aren't in the room, I wish I could take out my cigarette lighter and destroy the negative. But he knows he can't do that. But what he does do, he actually chooses the most inoffensive version of the photo, because there are probably about 12 versions of the different shots,
Mm-hmm.
So he sends what he thinks is the most innocuous one off to Capitol Tower. And again, by this time, they've got a new head of, album design and all the rest of it. And this guy is comparatively young compared with all the other old buffers at Capitol Tower. And he says, I love this. It is so arty and with it and all the rest of it.
Yeah, he loved
So
it. Mm-hmm.
He loved it. Yeah. So he, does a little bit of work on it and so on and so forth. Airbrushes out the bloodstains, by the way, from the white smocks. And, he thinks it's fantastic. Other folk higher up the food chain at Capitol don't get to look at it until almost it's too late, because obviously they've then ordered, all these copies to be made and stuff. But yeah, I mean, that's how the butcher cover happens, because, as I say, Bill Miller, is a survivalist. He wants to cling on at Capitol, and he's learned the lesson of Dave Dexter. So he's just saying to Epstein every now and again, he's thinking about this, it's a really great idea, Brian. Let me go and think about it. What do you think about an album sleeve? So it happens. If Dexter had been around, I think butcher cover would, I don't know. We don't know, do we? But it's unlikely, I would have thought, that the story would have rolled out the same, because Dexter would have chosen his own, Dave Dexter cover or something that they'd designed to his specifications. As I say, he would never have sent a cable or telegram or whatever, or letter to Brian Epstein saying, what do you think, Brian? You tell us what you'd like on the album sleeve. Because there's been so much nonsense and fighting, low-level fighting about the album sleeve appearance, that he just thought, well, I'll take the wind out of the argument. I'll just ask them what they want on the cover. For him, it didn't really matter. As long as they sold copies, did it really matter, whether you had a cow on the front of the sleeve or whatever? He wasn't that bothered. It's a kind of a creative extension from, people poo-poo Beatles 65, but butcher cover is like the grandchild of Beatles 65. It was the same photographer. And again, it's got a message to it. Very few people realize that Beatles 65 is the story of the four seasons. You've got a winter picture, a summer picture, a spring picture,
right,
and whatever. And the Beatles are dressed up in the different pictures according to the season and all that kind of stuff. So there's some sort of avant-garde leaning to that. But if you just look at it, you think, oh, that's a nice, pretty picture of the Beatles. But the two are related. It's an artistic step on from Beatles 65. A lot of interesting shots were taken at the same time as the Butcher cover. Lots of variations about that, which are in themselves very interesting. And again, upstairs, I've actually got an original undamaged First State Butcher cover, which is the pride and joy of my record collection. So, the cut, it's very rare, isn't it? It's unique among albums. It's probably one of the most famous albums of all time, but it's known for its card cover rather than the music that's on the plastic inside. But yeah, it's an amazing story. And as I say, Capitol lost a shed load of money on it, but well, they didn't lose money ultimately, obviously, because it sold millions of copies. But in the first month or whatever, I think they lost a couple of $100,000 because they sent most of the Butcher covers to landfill.
The recall effort was very expensive.
It was very expensive. But really, the genius who they only listened to a bit too late in the day said, hang on, guys, why are you destroying, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of album sleeves when you don't have to throw away one single album sleeve? You just need to grab the old album sleeve and paste over a new cover. It's going to cost you hardly anything.
And a legend was born. The legend was born,
yeah. But by that time, they'd literally landfilled hundreds of thousands of dollars in New Jersey or somewhere else. Wherever, yeah.
So after the Butcher cover, we do notice that Capitol albums start, for the most part, aligning with the UK. And it's
the new contract. It's the new contract. Epstein made a real meal of renegotiating this contract. I think that he started off with Jeffrey Ellis sitting down with Sir Joseph Lockwood at EMI in the summer of 66. They first started discussing a new record deal. They were just going round and round and round in circles. But it was eventually signed in, I think, the first couple of days of January 67. And of course, they got an improved royalty. Nothing like as good, by the way, as Allan Klein has got for the Rolling Stones. The Beatles were green with envy when they heard or they found out about the deal that Klein had struck with Decca in 1965. Massively better than the Beatles. Absolutely incredible. It was a groundbreaking record deal that Klein struck with Decca in 65. And as I say, the Beatles were almost in tears about it, saying to Epstein, how the hell did they get a contract like that? And Epstein was going, oh, don't worry, boys, it's our turn to be negotiating with EMI next year. We'll get a better deal, I promise you. He did get a better deal, but it was not a massive improvement. It was an improvement, but not a massive improvement. In terms of Capitol, of course, there was a clause in there which wasn't quite as amazing as it seemed on the surface. It basically said that sleeves should be harmonized, but if Capitol wanted to do something different, whether that be in terms of tracks or whether it be in terms of sleeves, it wasn't saying, no, you can't do it. What it was saying was, you need our consent. Now, you might think they're one of the same thing, but they weren't, because basically, again, an example that a lot of people give is Magical Mystery Tour. Capitol came up with this idea, the Magical Mystery Tour, partly, well, almost wholly, in fact, because in Britain, we were still walking around these EP things. I think you folk in America with great common sense have put those on the bonfire a long time before we did. And the Beatles EMI came up with this double EP concept in December 67, But Capitol just took one look at it and recognized the crop for what it was. And they said, look, it's just no one's going to buy this here. Do you really want to put out your new product and, very few people going to buy it? We've got a much better idea, boys. Here it is. It's using your cover, by the way. We're just going to use the cover that you're using on your double EP, and we're taking all the tracks that you've got on your double EP, but we need to make an album. So therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to stick the A and B side of your last three 1967 singles on the album as well. Does anybody say, oh, that's just like Beatles 65 or whatever? You're just recycling dull old B-sides. Nobody says that. Because what happens is Capitol point out to Epstein, well, Epstein's obviously dead by that time, but I mean, the concept of this thing was pointed out well before that, and pointing out to EMI, these are the sales predictions.
Right.
That's all they have to say. These are the sales predictions. Tell the Beatles how much money this is going to make, and tell them, oh, the cover's the same as their cover, but we're just going to shoehorn in these singles tracks, you know. So everybody's, yeah, great idea. Let's do it. The cynical watchword is, when the Beatles want to do it, it's fine. When Dave Dexter wants to do it, it's bad news. Fast forward a couple of years, you've got Allan Klein saying to the Beatles, you know, you're short of money, lads. And they're saying, Alan, what are we going to do? Tell us some ideas of how to make some more money. So he says, oh, I tell you what, I'll get my mate Marty, you know, and my lawyer. He's going to draw up a list of all the songs that you've recorded, but even Capitol haven't put out yet. So he draws up a list and says, here it is. We're going to put this album. It's odds and sods. It's things that haven't been put out in the States before. By the way, there's no rhyme or reason between it. You've got things like Can't Buy Me Love on there. And you've also got Hey Jude on there. So there's absolutely no musical hang together whatsoever. And, oh, by the way, what are we going to call it? Oh, well, we thought we'd call it Beatles Again. So they actually pressed up a few copies of Beatles Again. And then somebody said, well, hold on a minute. That's a bit cynical, isn't it? It's just like saying it's the same old stuff all over again. Can't call it Beatles Again. So pull in the few that you've already pressed and all the rest of it. What can we call it? Oh, Hey Jude. That was a very, very successful single. And of course, it's never been an album track. So let's call it that. That actually, out of the three main album charts in the States, that gets to number one on two of the three big album charts. Is anybody moaning or complaining about it or hiding when it's mentioned? No, it makes an absolute fortune, that album. Just at the right time they needed money, by the way. Yellow Submarine. Tell me, what's the difference between Yellow Submarine and some of these albums that the purists don't like, like Beatles' second album? What is it? It's a load of tracks, very good tracks, by the way, don't get me wrong, very good tracks that were passed over in 67, 68, because really they weren't as good as the other stuff that did get put out. But then even then, that's not good enough to string together an album. So we've got just about enough tracks to build up one side. Oh, I know what we'll do. We'll do what United Artists did. We'll get George Martin Orchestra to fill up the other side of the album. So, it's okay for people to kick to death United Artists' Hard Day's Night album. But as soon as, the Beatles come up with Yellow Submarine, oh, that's amazing. That's really arty and with it and Blue Meanies and all the rest of it. But it was, it was a project to start with that the Beatles didn't really want to have anything to do with. It was only when it started to,
right.
They just tacked a little bit on the end of the movie where the Beatles come on in person and go, hello, everybody, waving and all the rest of it. I'm not being cynical. I'm not a cynic by nature, but, people who are cynics would say that when it's okay, there's no problem. When someone else wants to do it and we're not in the mood, it's some artistic travesty.
That's pretty common, I think.
There we are.
Did Allan Klein stepping in after Brian's death, did they change anything about Capitol's relationship with the Beatles, or was that contract already so set in stone that he couldn't really do?
No, I mean, it's a good question because, again, if Dave Dexter is this sort of, I don't know, got these horns and a tail and a black cloak kind of image with a lot of Beatles fans, then you can say, well, that's nothing compared with Allan Klein. Even today.
Oh, he's Lucifer himself compared to that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The rise and decline of the Beatles, Allan Klein was no saint, and you won't catch me saying that, but Allan Klein was an absolute legend as a businessman. He never pretended to be a massive music fan, but he was an absolute legend as a business manager. And of course, he made sure he feathered his own nest. Of course he did. But he actually made sure that most of his artists made a few bucks as well. We all know the negative stories about Allan Klein. Basically, as you know, when Brian Epstein sadly died in late 67, the Beatles had this view, and who could blame them? They thought, oh, we don't really need a manager. Brian, yeah, he's been, signing pieces of paper and sitting behind his desk for the last couple of years, but he's not really been managing us from an artistic point of view. His company still exists. So, the people who are going to sign the checks and pay our bills and invoices, that's all being taken care of by Brian's company. Brian sadly isn't here anymore. And they were as upset about that and, gutted as everybody else. But he hasn't really been playing any artistic role in what we do for a long, long time. And do we really need a manager? We're such a successful group. We've got great songwriters. We've got lots of ideas. Why can't we manage ourselves? And that was a great idea. It was a revolutionary idea. And to be fair, they gave it 100%. But after about a year, it began to dawn on them that maybe this isn't working out. They weren't looking at the statistics, Apple, how much money they were losing. They'd opened this boutique, lovely idea, but, it lost massive money, partly because people were just shoplifting the stuff. And it was run by a bunch of hippies who were so far out of it. They allegedly didn't notice people running out the door with hundreds of pounds worth of gear. But sooner or later, and again, it's typical that it's John Lennon who kind of speaks out at the end of the day, because as I say, he might be the John Lennon that we all know and love, but there was that very sort of brutalistic black and white outlook with him as well. And when he noticed that something wasn't working, he spoke up and said it, So he actually went public, didn't he, and said, we're losing money and all this kind of stuff. Allan Klein, like a vulture, is lapping this up in his morning paper in New York and immediately gets hold of John Lennon and says, John, I've just heard what you had to say about the Beatles losing money. If you want to save your career and save Apple and whatever, I'm the man. And that's when John Lennon starts talking to Klein. Of course, because Klein's he's the opposite of Epstein. Epstein is a soft as soap character. He's an English gentleman with his very fine manners and all the rest of it. Whereas Klein is the exact opposite, very brutalistic New Yorker. Klein does basically get the bull by the horns. He makes people redundant from Apple. He starts grabbing hold of the problems where they're losing money. But he's not just one of those people who hits parts of the company that's losing money. He's also, more importantly, saying, well, yeah, I'm controlling the money that you're losing, but I've got some great ideas how you can start making a hell of a lot more money than you're making at the moment. So he does actually very slowly, not deliberately, starts encouraging them with their thoughts that were there already about solo projects. He also recognizes something that's so obvious that, you trip over it. And that's the fact that even though Epstein renegotiated the contract in 1966, it's still a stinker of an agreement. It just doesn't smell as awful as the old agreement. So he decides that, says, look, lads, this agreement, fine, but it's not as good as the one I negotiated with Stones that you all know about. That's a fantastic agreement. Even to this day, Keith Richards of the Stones, whatever experiences they had with Klein, Keith Richards is still quite positive about Klein in saying that, he was just a money machine. If I wanted to buy a new Rolls Royce, I just rang Alan and the money would be round in a brown paper bag by the end of the afternoon. He just had so many ideas about how you could get your hands on more money. Most of them legal, by the way, but some of them a little bit questionable. But, Klein says, well, lads, you've got a stinker of an agreement even now. So he says, why don't you allow me to go to EMI, go to Sir Joseph Lockwood and renegotiate this and get you a deal like the Stones? And they said, great, go and do it, Alan. Even Paul McCartney said, go and do it. So he went to Lockwood. Initially, doesn't actually get anywhere because Lockwood doesn't roll over like a sheep as Lewis did at Decca. Lockwood is of the view that, the Beatles they're on the wane now. It's the end of the 1960s. We're not so in awe of the Beatles. Give it a couple of years, they'll probably be not finished, but, Lockwood just couldn't be convinced that it was worth a new deal that gave the Beatles a much greater royalty and all the rest of it. Klein wasn't that surprised, by the way. He went to Lockwood out of protocol, really, first, but he wasn't totally surprised that Lockwood was resistant to his proposals. As we've said earlier in these discussions, although we Brits like to think that, we're the center of the universe, basically the UK record market in those days was a very, very small island in a very, very big ocean. We weren't selling anything, just like a microdot compared with the massive American market or the European market. So, Klein wasn't that brokenhearted, but the genius of what he did next was almost his last sentence or two at the end of his meeting with Lockwood. He said something like, look, Joe, I'm really sorry that we've not been able to strike a deal, but But I take it you would have no objection at all to me flying over to Los Angeles and sitting down with Capitol and striking a separate deal with them. And Lockwood, he just wasn't bothered. So yeah, if you want to do that, if you want to go to Los Angeles and meet Alan Livingston and strike a separate independent deal with Capitol, be my guest. It's up to you. Because Lockwood has just got this view that Beatles, fantastic, but nothing lasts forever. They've had a good run. So why should we sign a brand new deal with them when, they're moving downwards and their trajectory is down, not up? Of course, that was a big mistake, but, let's forget about that for a minute. But Klein does exactly that. He goes over to Los Angeles. He meets with Livingston. He gives him a load of old bull about, well, Alan, lots of people want to sign the Beatles. Yes, they're in this contract with EMI and yourselves. But you know what I did with the Stones? I trooped them into the Decca boardroom and just said, Decca, look, you might not want to give us a new deal, but if you don't, we're just going to stop recording for you. And where's that going to leave you? So Livingston, the writing's on the wall before Klein comes in. He knows what Allan Klein's all about. And Klein says to him, look, I've advised the Beatles that although there are RCA, Columbia, all these other people who would literally write a bottomless check, but I persuaded the Beatles to hang in there with you, Capitol. And if you can make us the right sort of offer and the right sort of deal, we're going to stick with you. But obviously, if you can't, there's plenty of other guys, queuing up down the street that would pull us in and give us the fantastic deal. So Klein puts on the table, it's kind of like the Stones deal, but it's several streets ahead of that. The Stones deal was all about what Klein called buy-sell deals, where his company actually physically produced the albums, the vinyl, the covers, everything else, and then sells them to the label, whether it's Decca, London or Capitol. The other piece of genius that he put in there, which wasn't in the Stones thing for obvious reasons, was that now there was this prospect of the Beatles not only carrying on as a massively popular group, but now you've actually got almost four solo artists. You've got prospect of a John Lennon solo album and a Paul McCartney solo album. Let's bring in this all-encompassing deal that involves solo projects as well as group projects. And by the way, Capitol, you can decide. We'll tell you that an album is going to be coming out in a couple of months' time. If there's a solo album by John Lennon, we'll say, John's got this idea coming out, live piece in Toronto or something like that. And you will decide whether you want that to fall into category A or category B. If it's in category A, then Capitol get a big bite of the royalties. If it's something they're not really keen on, it goes into group B. But if it surprisingly sells, Capitol lose out because the royalty rate for a solo album that they've turned down is much higher. And that's exactly what happens, by the way, with Live Peace in Toronto. Capitol think it's a bit, what's it all about? No, I'm not interested. Thanks for offering, but no thanks. But obviously they put it out, but it doesn't go into the sort of top draw list. But it sounds like hotcakes, that album. Live Peace in Toronto sold like hotcakes. And Capitol, they got a nice payday, but it wasn't anything like as big as John Lennon's payday. So this improves Klein's stock with John Lennon a hint. But it was a fantastic deal he struck with Capitol. It was a very unique and advantageous deal. And as we said before, he came up with other ideas, money spinners. He said part of the Capitol deal, Apple got the right to re-release all the Beatles' Capitol albums, but with an Apple logo on them. So again, let's forget about the rude faces we pulled about Beatles 65 and all the rest of it. Now it's on the Apple label. It's great, and go and buy everybody. So Apple absolutely make a killing in 1970, 71, 72, 73, when all of the old Capitol stuff is now being pumped out on the Apple label. Great idea. So there were lots of unique ideas he came up with. It was actually his idea, as far as I know, to exploit this, originally Get Back project idea. Why don't we use the film, get United Artists to put it out and all the rest of it? And that then pays off United Artists. It's the last film we're honor bound to give them. But despite what people say about Let It Be, it wasn't a bad payday, the Let It Be movie.
Oh, I'm sure.
The Let It Be box set, that brought in a lot of money. So there's quite a few things that were Klein's ideas that have now been, not really associated with Klein. Forget about his business ethics for a minute. Even they're exaggerated, I think, sometimes. But he did bring home the sheep, as it were, in terms of the job they gave him. In other words, to stop the hemorrhage of money that's going out of Apple and to start making us some more money. And he did both.
Thank you so much, Andrew. This has been so fascinating. And, your book is great. And we hope that all of our listeners will check out Capitol Gains. But just, and like on a high level here, if Capitol hadn't signed the Beatles at all, how do you think that would have changed not just their career, but the actual shape of the global music industry?
Sure. But again, that's a great question. I mean, it's like I've always said, the history of the Beatles, the history of music is actually no different from any other genre of history. It's the same rules of evidence. In other words, let's listen to people who were there at the time, heard at the time, saw at the time, wrote down what they were experiencing at the time, as opposed to the myriad of myths and embellishments that have taken place in the years that have gone by. But equally, it's also fascinating in the sense that it's part of this bigger historical debate. What would America have been like if Lee Harvey Oswald had missed? The history of America would be massively different. But how different? Nobody really knows because, of course, it never happened. What would have happened if we, by some touch or other, we could have avoided World War II? The world would have been massively different. What would have happened to the Beatles and all the rest of us if Capitol had just stuck to their guns and said, sorry, we're not interested? I think there are two things we can say. Number one, I think we've got it on reliable evidence, and it's in the book. L.G. Wood, the managing director of EMI, was actually in New York at the time. This last ditch attempt was made to entice Capitol on board. But as he said himself in a little known testimony, he went to New York. He was sitting in EMI's office building in New York. He said he could see out the window an old friend of his in the Columbia offices. And he said something like, well, I'm really glad, obviously, that we pulled off a deal with Capitol. But if they'd have said no, I'd have probably walked next door and spoken to my friend, and Columbia would have signed up the Beatles. And we're pretty sure that is an accurate prediction or statement there, because what happened, all the other things that Dexter turned away, strangely enough, they're all signed up by Columbia, the Yardbirds, all these people. So there was obviously some conduit, some dialogue between L.G. Wood at EMI and his old friend who was working in A&R at Columbia. So my guess is, and based on what L.G. Wood said, which I think is pretty accurate, and again, this old myth that a few people like George Martin tell about, EMI getting really hacked off with all these rejections. So either L.G. Wood, depends on the storyteller, but it's either L.G. Wood or Joseph Lockwood in these stories that effectively picks up the phone in London and breathes expletives down the line to Hollywood saying, we're just sick to death of your attitude. We're ordering you to put this out. Get on with it. Well, we all know now that they couldn't have done that contractually anyway.
Right. So
a load of hokum anyway. But what would have happened? I would speculate that based on what L.G. Wood has said, and also a couple of people who were in the picture at Columbia at the time, the Beatles would probably have been signed by Columbia. Would life have been exactly the same as it was with Capitol? I don't think so, but we'll never know. I think the Beatles, in any case, would have been a massive success. Columbia, they wouldn't have had the benefit of this Lou Levy treasure chest, they might not even have been that motivated to throw tons of money at promoting I Want to Hold Your Hand. It would have probably been a hit. It would probably have been a number one. But would Columbia have given the Beatles every ounce of buckshot to launch their career in the States? Columbia were already a fat cat. In 1963, they only had one rock artist on their repertoire, and that was Dion and, formerly of Dion and the Belmonts. They had Bob Dylan, of course. Yeah, let's not forget old Bob Dylan, the hungry-looking kid. But they had no real rock presence, desire, or enthusiasm. And that didn't really change until they got hold of the Byrds and a couple of other bands best part of a year later. So, they didn't have the burning ambition that Capitol did. Capitol were this new kid on the block. Even in the mid-60s, they weren't an old company. And once they got the Beatles conversion, as it were, pumped into them, they went off like the newly converted on the road to Rome, Yeah. So Would they have got that big boost, that big oomph from Columbia? Well, maybe they would have done. We're never going to know now because, time travel isn't possible, or at least it's not at the moment. But I would guess they would have been signed up by Columbia. I think they would have done very well. Would they have done as well as they did with Capitol? I don't know. I'm just guessing. I'd say probably not. But they'd almost still have been a worldwide hit and all the rest of it. But it would be the world as we know it, but not quite. It would obviously have been different. It would never have been the same scenario as with Capitol.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for this time. I loved reading the book. I encourage everybody, Capital Gains, exposing the conflict between the Beatles and the record label that made them. Where can our listeners follow you and your work?
Sure. I think there's already been a lot of exposure for the book already on podcasts. But I've got a website, andrewcook.org.uk. That features a bit about this book, also obviously about other books and TV that I've done as well. But Amazon is a great place to get the book as well. So it's not going to be too difficult to pick up copies.
Great. Well, thank you so much again.
Thank you. This has been great.
Really well. I've loved being on. It's been a really great time. And as I say, the questions have been fantastic and I've really enjoyed it. So thank you for inviting me, and I hope your listeners, enjoy it half as much as I did.
Oh, that's so nice.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. That's it for us today. Thanks so much for listening to BC the Beatles. As always, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you're listening right now, and give us a rating and review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter /X, and TikTok. We'll be posting photos and more from this episode and beyond. And you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. And we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.